he's making, I think, rational decisions in that fateful moment, but all of those decisions add up to just this colossal piece of bad luck that he hits the iceberg. He doesn't do it, the ship does it. The ship hits the iceberg in this just the worst possible way. I mean, if he'd hit it, I suspect if there had just been a few feet of difference, right, he would have missed it entirely, or he would have hit it so hard that it would have opened a bigger hole, but in a smaller part of the ship, if that makes sense. I mean, the ship could have withstood a giant hole in one or two compartments, that would have been perfectly fine. And I think that's such a key part of the story, and we often don't really think about that, right? Just what a
And
colossal bad luck that was.
like you said, if he hit it straight on, maybe 150 people would have died, but that's not a decision anybody would have made, and he would have been fired immediately for that decision.
I mean, you
Because nobody could have predicted that this would have happened by making the decision he made.
yeah, I mean, who knows, but I suspect you're right. I mean, I suspect it would have been said, "Hey, like, the ship, could have probably survived either way, so why didn't you try to get around it," right? I mean, there just would have been no if it hadn't happened, we probably wouldn't have any idea that that type of collision to a ship could happen, right? I mean, I don't maybe there is another one. I mean, people who are more I'm a cultural historian, not a maritime historian, and there may be other maritime historians who could say there's an example of another ship having a collision with an iceberg in that way, where it just scrapes along the side and kind of opens a cut in the side of the ship. But I don't know of one, right? It's a really hard thing to do if you think about it.
When you look at preparation and hubris, there's a lot of points in this story where lifeboats come up, obviously. One thing that I learned from listening to the podcast you were on was that the idea of lifeboats, actually, it was more as ferries. That and that gave me a lot more context as to, while it might have been an arrogant thing to not have enough lifeboats, it was thought that if a ship were to sink, these lifeboats would be used to kind of ferry passengers to the ship that was helping them, and then the lifeboats would go back, which gives a little bit of logic to why they didn't need lifeboats for anybody for to fit everybody. What was the thought process at the time of why they didn't have lifeboats? Was it Can we look at that as one of the points of hubris, or did a lot of ships at the time not have enough lifeboats because they viewed them as more of ferries in between ships as opposed to vessels that would save people and they'd be floating and needed enough capacity for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to this idea that they thought that sort of maritime technology, right, had outstripped the ability to cause a disaster like the Titanic. The Titanic had a perfectly normal number of lifeboats, right? It was in full compliance with any legal requirement for lifeboats, and in fact had more lifeboats than it needed to have legally, right? I think it had 4 extra lifeboats. Some of that was a little ridiculous because, the one of the most famous lifeboats on Titanic, right, is collapsible lifeboat B, right? So that's one you see it in the film, actually, in the Cameron film. It was lashed to the top of the deck house, right? Basically, kind of lashed to the top of the bridge of the Titanic, and it completely I mean, if you think about, like, a ship is sinking and you're trying to get a lifeboat launched, and then you've got this thing that's tied to the very top of the ship, I mean, it was impossible to get it down. They did manage to get it loose just before the ship sank, and it actually washes off the ship upside down, right? And then, um, Charles Lightoller, one of the ship's officers, and, mostly other crew members, they survived by kind of trying to stand and balance on the top of that thing all night long. So, I mean, that's a good example of how they thought they were never gonna have to use those lifeboats, right? So, yeah, they thought of lifeboats as having a variety of purposes, including, ferrying passengers to another ship potentially. They just didn't really think of them as you were ever gonna have to put everybody in a lifeboat. It's also the case that they're not really thinking about, right, how long on a ship the size of Titanic, because we have to think about how fast ships were getting bigger in the early 20th century, right? It's just this exponential, we go from the age of, what we would think of as like a sailing ship, right? So have your vision of a 19th century sailing ship going across the Atlantic to the Titanic in like 50 years. So it's a huge change. It's a huge change from wooden ships to iron and steel ships, right? It's a huge change from sailing ships to ships with steam engines and then eventually with diesel engines. And it's all happening very, very fast, and the ships are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And all of the details of sailing a ship just aren't keeping up with that, right? And lifeboats are one of those, and they're not really thinking too, and, we can think about this as we think about trying to get those lifeboats loaded on the Titanic, right? That how long it takes to get those lifeboats loaded. I mean, for anybody who's listening who's ever been on a cruise, right? And you think about when you go in on a cruise, sometimes you're lucky and there's a dock that can handle a big cruise ship, but sometimes it can't, right? In some of these ports, and so you have to be tendered off. You essentially have to be taken off in a lifeboat. Think of how long you had to queue up, right, to get off the ship. And, it takes a long time to load thousands of people. Think about getting on and off an airplane, how long that takes, and that's just a couple hundred people, right? So, it's just a really cumbersome process, which accounts for some of why the Titanic lifeboats were loaded in the way they did. There's a lot of factors there, but that certainly was part of the picture, is it just takes a long time to get lifeboats loaded.
If we look to the voyage itself now, what do you view as some of the areas of, I guess, greatest controversy about why this happened? A lot of people talk about, did Captain Smith do something wrong? Did they not heed iceberg warnings sufficiently? Why don't we start with the icebergs and if they heeded them sufficiently? Because there were a lot of warnings that night that they got on their radio system about icebergs. Did they do anything that other ships wouldn't have done, though, in regards to those icebergs? Like, what was typical protocol, and did they veer from that? And I guess that ties in with Captain Smith because he's the captain and would have made the calls on that.
Well, I think we have to say they didn't heed them sufficiently, right? Because they hit an iceberg. So, you know, I think we're playing prima facie evidence that they didn't. I mean, if they had been more attentive to the warnings, they might not have hit an iceberg, right? But having said that,
I guess the better way of phrasing that is, with the information they had, were their decisions reasonable at the time before they hit?
yeah, I'm not trying. I mean, I'm not trying to be entirely facetious here. I just think, I mean, that's an important point, right? That
Yes.
yes, they should have heeded the iceberg warnings better because they might not have hit an iceberg, right? But having said that, right, they weren't doing anything that any other ship wouldn't have done. Like, um, I mean, some of the, there is the famous story of the Californian, right, which is the ship that might have been in a position to get to the Titanic faster, but decides to not really investigate, right, these weird lights and flashes that it's seeing on the horizon. The Californian had stopped because of ice, basically, because they weren't going to sail through a field of ice at night. But the Californian is a tin pot freighter, right? It's not under any pressure from really wealthy passengers and powerful people to get to New York on time, right? The Titanic is much bigger. It's thinking of itself as much less vulnerable to hitting an iceberg than a ship like the Californian would be. And it's also thinking, what these passengers on this ship had paid for, right, is a quick and smooth journey across the Atlantic. Again, think of how frustrated you get if your airplane flight is delayed or your other travel arrangements are delayed, right? People get grumpy. And when the people getting grumpy are, the John Jacob Astors and the Benjamin Guggenheims of the world, then that's a lot of pressure on White Star. And so I think the Titanic is behaving in a perfectly normal way. I think Captain Smith is making, what with hindsight seem perhaps like irrational decisions, but in the context that he's dealing with are probably pretty rational decisions about how to deal with this. We also have to think about that they're getting most of these ice warnings, they're getting over the radio. I think one or two of them they got because they were close enough to another ship that they actually got kind of like a little Morse code light flashes sort of thing directly from that ship. Most of them are coming over the radio. Radio is in its very early infancy as a maritime technology. In 1912, this is something that captains have never really had before. You could see Smith kind of being like, well, if I'd been sailing this thing 3 years ago, I wouldn't even have had this information. So why would I, really, I've never hit an iceberg before. Why would I really react to it? Probably, I've been on lots of voyages where if we'd had radio, I would have been getting all these ice warnings. It's really the radio that's causing the ice warnings, not the ice, right? And so I think he's making reasonable decisions based on what was standard maritime practice at the time. It's just with hindsight, we know they were completely unreasonable, right? When the sun comes up that morning, right, the morning of April 15th, 1912, they're surrounded by ice, right? There's icebergs everywhere. It's not like they got unlucky and hit the one iceberg that was floating out there in the North Atlantic. I mean, there's ice all over the place, right? They're in the middle of a very dangerous ice field. The Carpathia that does come to rescue the passengers, right? It has to dodge ice kind of all night long, right? The captain of the Carpathia has got lots of lookouts posted because he knows, right, that there's ice everywhere, and they were probably lucky not to hit one themselves as fast as they were going. So, it's one of those things that, it's hard to say, "Oh, Captain Smith, that was, he caused the disaster." I mean, I don't think he does, but, it's also hard to avoid saying they didn't take seriously what, with hindsight, was a obvious danger, of which they were very aware.
And would the obvious decision in hindsight have been, like, stop or slow down? What did protocol suggest, if there was one, if you were concerned about icebergs?
I think any and all of the above. I don't think they would have stopped in a million years. I mean, I don't think, um, I just don't think that was even a possibility. It's the maiden voyage of this very famous ship, right? The idea that it's gonna stop for an iceberg. I mean, again, those wealthy and powerful passengers are gonna be saying, "I thought the ship was unsinkable," aren't we safe from that sort of thing?
Do you think there's any sorry, do you think there's any credence to the notion that there was pressure that was put on by people on the ship or some of the higher ups, like Bruce Ismay saying, "We wanna get there sooner. Don't slow down. We actually wanna speed up because we wanna surprise them in New York City in New York by getting there faster." Do you think that actually came into play with the decision making? That comes up in the movie Titanic, and some people have commented on that in history, but is there enough evidence to really say that was a motivating factor?
The evidence is one passenger at one of the inquiries said that happened, said that there was a conversation that she overheard, a conversation between J. Bruce Ismay, who's the managing director of the White Star Line, who's on board the ship for the maiden voyage, and Captain Smith, in which she overheard Ismay basically pressuring Captain Smith to try to get into New York the night before. So the appearance of that scene in the Cameron film is not a dramatic embellishment because it is based on something that was actually testified to at one of the inquiries. Now, it's only one passenger who says it. I have always been a little bit dubious about it. The Titanic was not built for speed. It was built for comfort and luxury. It is not in any way the fastest ship on the North Atlantic. That still belonged to the Cunard ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, who were much, much faster ships than the Titanic was. And I'm extremely dubious that they would have been trying to get into New York the night before, because docking a ship the size of Titanic at night when the crew on shore who were supposed to be doing this weren't prepared to do it, I just can't think that they would have actually attempted that. So I'm not quite sure what the purpose of pushing would have been. I can see that it would have been more plausible that there may have been some reason because of maybe minor course changes to do with the icebergs, maybe because Titanic was not quite even going at the maximum speed it could go at because there had been a coal strike back in Britain, and it was having to conserve coal a little bit on the journey across the North Atlantic. That maybe Ismay was getting a little bit itchy that they were gonna be late, right? And that might have been a more plausible scenario, right? That's not what the passenger actually said, that Ismay was pushing Smith to get in significantly early. I could just see that, maybe Ismay just, you could see if you're the managing director of White Star and you're on board the ship and you want everything to be perfect, right? I mean, he's feeling under pressure, right? To have everything perfect, because he wants to show off this amazing new ship that White Star has put on the ocean. And so you could see him maybe getting caught in a mindset there where he's thinking, "Ooh, I don't wanna be even a little bit late." And so maybe he expressed some concern to Smith about that. I mean, that's just pure speculation. I have no idea. It just strikes me as a little bit more plausible. If such a conversation did take place, it strikes me as that's maybe a little bit more plausible a context for it than pushing to get into New York the night before. Like, that just doesn't seem I just don't understand why that would have even been thought of as a good idea.
outside of not really heeding the iceberg warnings, what are some of the main kind of areas that you or other people think these are mistakes that Captain Smith or other people made during this voyage that people point back to and say, "Why did they do that?" And do you think there's credence to those things?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know, mistakes during the voyage, I mean, I think most of them have to do with, again, with the icebergs, right? With being aware that you're in, it's a very again, it's a very bad spring for ice, and you've now received numerous ice warnings that are telling you that you're entering into what is a pretty massive ice field. I think that's if we're gonna talk about, sort of mistakes, I mean, I think, we have to sort of start and stop there, right? I don't know that it's a mistake, but I think that's the thing that matters, right? I mean, if we're talking about the voyage itself, not what happens once they hit the iceberg.